All right, everybody, we're back with World of Ideas. We're still in a bunch of C's here. It's going to jump, in the book, it kind of jumps a little bit of it. I'm going to kind of pair a couple of them together in one and then move on alphabetically from there. So I know before I kind of paired a couple of them together, and I'm going to do that again with this. So the first one with this is competition. We're going to really talk about this, not just it's not like sports or anything like that. We're talking sort of economic, maybe even some social a little bit, but it's really going to be sort of economic and political. So in economics, market rivalry among businesses. In natural science, the rivalry among life forms, both plants and animals, for limited resources, such as territory, water, and food. Successful competition is the basis of natural selection. That's also slightly skewed from actual sort of natural selection. Um, not only Darwinism, but also the actual competition in nature. It's a little bit of a skewed look. The economic theory of competition spans a continuum from perfect competition, in which many sellers offer the same product under the same circumstances, to monopoly, in which a product is available from only one source, which therefore has no competition. So everyone's competing versus kind of no one's competing. There's just one place to get a thing. Both of these model circumstances are rare. More common are atomistic and monopolistic, not full monopoly, but monopolistic competition and oligopoly. I always have trouble with that one. Perfect competition is the ideal state of a free market economy, in which price is determined solely by supply and demand. Wholesale grain markets, for example, approach perfect competition since there are many producers and their products are essentially identical. Atomistic competition occurs when many different products are offered by many different sellers, such as vendors at a flea market who compete for a limited supply of consumer cash. Monopolistic competition is seen when several firms sell different versions of the same kind of product. Monopolistic competition exists among restaurants, for instance, because although they are all vying for the business of people who want to eat out, each offers a different cuisine, ambiance, price range, and so on. A restaurateur may have a local monopoly on Mexican food, but not on dining options. So there's one kind of product, but different ways to kind of get that product, sort of thing. An oligopoly is an industry with only a few big producers or sellers, whether one company's product is indistinguishable from the others, for example, oil, or is differentiated in one or more ways, like automobiles. Because of the relatively small number and the members of the oligopoly are unusually interdependent, since the actions of one, say raising or lowering the prices, will quickly be duplicated by the others. Prices in an oligopoly, based on oligarchy, tend to be fairly stable, not necessarily great, not necessarily ideal, but fairly stable. Therefore, and competition is generally carried on in other arenas, although both price fixing and price wars occur, as has happened, for instance, in the American airline industry. Trademarks, advertising, and other means of distinguishing similar products are important elements in both oligopolistic and monopolistic competition. So you can think like mobile phones, or everyone losing their crap over oddly colored sneakers. So, essentially, in a lot of ways, sorry, but Nike, Reebok, Adidas, some of these other ones, essentially, they're kind of the same product. There are some of the ones where maybe you do get a little bit of what you pay for, but there's a difference between if you get like classic clamshell Adidas or Adidas versus the one place on East 55th that sells the sort of like knockoff ones for 25 bucks each. In some instances, you kind of get what you pay for. But essentially, all these things are kind of the same. Mobile phones are kind of the same, especially now that, well, not now, they always were, but especially since, they're all have the planned obsolescence where they're all built to basically stop working in one way or another, or at least as efficiently, somewhere around when your sort of warranty or contract wears out, probably a little bit before, to try and maybe prod you with annoyance to try and get, you to say, screw it, I'm just going to spend a whole crap load of money to get a new thing anyway, even though my thing's not up. And I think in another thing we've talked about some of the airline stuff. I mean, it's the same product. They're getting you from point A to point B. They have a vested interest in not, crashing the airplane with that too. But there are a bunch of them, the airlines, that all sort of got together to keep their fares sort of artificially high, and then talk about all the sort of little insidious, insipid little things they do to charge you a little bit more. It used to be you have your carry-on, and you have, like, two things you can check under the, you have like one or two carry-ons, one or two things you can check in the plane, and maybe a personal bag or something, and that was in your ticket. Now you're getting charged for carry-ons, and you're getting charged for, you know, um, the the bags that you check in, and you're getting charged for the, like it used to be, whatever. You never had to be with this before. Computers are similar too. It used to be you buy a computer, you are buying the programs that came on it. For example, if you got a PC, you have different PC manufacturers, but they all have Windows on it. They all got the Microsoft stuff on it. So you're buying, kind of the same programs but slightly different computers. But now you have it where, even back in the day where you used to be able to buy whatever computer you had, you got the Microsoft stuff that came with it. You might have to check it in online or something, but you got that. Now, not only do you have to pay for the computer and pay for the product on the computer, but now Microsoft wants you to pay for the product that you used to get for free anyway. So all these things, when they're big enough and they have that much control, they can start doing these little, really sort of just messed up things to try and just bleed more out of you. A monopoly exists when the production, distribution, or sale of a product, or all three, is controlled by a single firm. This occurred in the early years of the computer industry, when only one company, IBM, possessed the essential technology. In a monopoly situation, production and price are set at levels intended to maximize profit. The supply of a product is often artificially limited, or its price unrealistically inflated, leading to an inefficient use of society's resources. So the company that has the monopoly can either set the price at just a ridiculous price because it's the only thing that's there. What are you going to do if you want the thing? Or they can say, we're going to keep this price high because we're only making like 100 of these things. They have the capacity to make exponentially more, but they're not doing it because they're going to make sure they can get as much out of the consumer as they possibly can. So that's sort of competition. And sort of linking in with that here, we're going to talk about conservatism. Let me put this back over here so I can find that other place. Sorry. All right, political and social outlook that seeks to preserve systems and institutions that have been tested by time, or at least have been there for a long time, whether or not the testing of these things were universally helpful or not. The opposite of radicalism, and often of liberalism. Conservatives are generally respectful of tradition, resistant to change, especially rapid or sweeping change, and skeptical of abstract ideologies or utopian doctrines. So utopian means like the most, like, if we did this thing, our society could just be wonderful and everyone would be happy and free, and everything would be super cool. But a lot of this time, it's, this is where you get the sort of, idea of, yes, there are times where it is healthy and helpful to have, a certain amount of rootedness in the past, and there are some things that that have worked, and we can continue to use the things that do work. But now when you become hyper attached to this one way of doing things, that's when a lot of things start becoming unhealthy. So you think of like a puddle of water that's just been sitting there for a long time. It's stagnant and diseased. A branch that falls off a tree that is no longer flexible can be easily broken. So that's one of the sort of problems with that, and especially since it's going to reinforce power structures. It's June 1st, 2020, and we're dealing with a lot of stuff showing a lot of the inherent sort of evil of a lot of the prevailing power structures that have been going on in the country since its founding, and even you can go back further than that into the countries that gave birth to the United States as well. But you're starting to see like, hey, this stuff has always happened. It's only now that everyone's got a portable camera that can now capture how often these sort of really horrible, evil deeds that people are just getting away with, because either they're BSing the paperwork, or it's, their things are being shuffled around because of the inherent, racism and inherent sort of power structure that just has allowed people to get away with very heinous things for quite some time. And that's the sort of, the detractor from a lot of that conservatism. Although such principles are ancient, political conservatism, as we know it, first arose as an alarmed response to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So, Enlightenment, people are thinking differently now. Culturally things are kind of changing. Different science things, different philosophies, and things like that are being tried. This whole idea where now maybe people have a certain amount of individual sort of sovereignty instead of actually sovereigns telling them what to do. French Revolution went from, trying to get rights to murdering nobles to murdering everybody else, and then which then cycled back into Napoleonic imperialist despotism. But it's like, oh, stuff's changing super fast, and if people tend to be conservative when they're established in that conservative structure. So again, if we just use 1st June 2020 sort of thing, there's still a white straight male power structure in the United States and in much of the world, especially that have been influenced by Western Europe. And now it's like, oh, look, other people are people too. Other people should be having the rights and the opportunities that you've just been keeping to yourself this whole time. And they're like, no, we're going to still do everything we can to keep this to ourselves. So that, again, that's where that is, as much as some things, there's a rune othala, other practices talk about ancestors and things like that. There are certain things that work well and have worked well over time. But there's a lot of things that's a lot of pretty heinous and insidious and even outright evil and wrong things that have been going on over time, and they work for certain people, and those certain people are going to try and hold on to that. Edmund Burke and others warned the wholesale overthrow of established institutions would lead to chaos. The term seems to have been coined by the French romantic novelist Chateaubriand, but it joined the political lexicon when the British pro-monarchist Tory party, as opposed to the Whigs, changed its name to the Conservative Party in 1832. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century and amid the social and economic turmoil created by the Industrial Revolution and the rising middle class, many Europeans sought stability in traditional institutions: absolute monarchy, aristocracy, hereditary property, social hierarchy, and the established church. So in the 19th century Industrial Revolution, people who weren't those established people were starting to get a lot of money. They were starting to get property. They were starting to get power and control. And those other forms of power and control were kind of like, we don't like this, so we're going to kind of double down in the things that this makes us great. We have a king. We have this church that tells us what to do. We have these people who have for centuries and generations been born and bred into privilege because they know what to do, and then they start getting into divine mandates where, oh well, we're in this because God made it this way, and that starts again cycling a lot of really bad stuff. Conservatism is not antithetical to change, as is often supposed, but sees useful progress as deriving from precedent, so stuff that happened before, and accumulated wisdom, and therefore rooted in the virtues and values of the past. So change is going to be seen in the conservative system be happening more slowly. It's you've got to, it's taking those ideas of scientific method of validity and reliability, so test what you're going to test and test what you're going to test over time, and making that have to take maybe more time for stuff to happen. A lot of times you'll see where you know the established thought is one thing, someone comes in and challenges it like, no, it's really something else, and it takes time for that to sit up into now be the new thing. For example, I usually use Einstein as an example of this when I talk about a lot of the problems I see with um, the sort of scientific, the religious view we have in the West now of scientists and scientific things, and they'll say, well, we're better than everything else because when there's new information, we will change our minds and we'll move paradigms, but they don't. Time and time and time and time again, you see where people who are established and are the ones sort of setting the rules for everyone else, if there is new information, a lot of the times they're doing what they can to make sure that people who are saying new and different things don't get funding. They'll sort of ad hominem attack them as just being fringe and insane. But over time, when those ideas sort of start sinking in, then another generation comes in and starts accepting it a little bit more. So Einstein's whole thing with first special, then general relativity had a lot of people who weren't into it in the scientific community, still even back then, 100 plus years ago, saying the same things that they're telling people now. And they were like, no, no, this can't be it, this can't be it, no, it doesn't happen like that, this doesn't do that. But it ended up being correct. His theories of relativity ended up being correct. The stuff he did with photons and quanta photons ended up being correct, and if I remember correctly, that's what he got his Nobel Prize for. Interestingly enough, Einstein gets a little bit older, gets a little bit more credit, gets a little bit more fame, now becomes the sort of establishment, and everyone's going in with his thing. And then a little bit later, that's when quantum physics starts getting invented and starts getting proven. Quantum mechanics is sort of like the most proven thing we have in the world 100 years later. And his research with like quanta of light, I believe, if I remember, I'm trying to remember this correctly, I believe that those were things that helped sort of push quantum mechanics through and become a thing. But he, now that he's established, had his set ideas of what the universe should be in terms of fields. And God does not play dice. That all this stuff with chance and statistics and these things that go on with quantum physics is wrong because there's too much left to change. There needs to be some sort of field that makes all this. So we're going to figure out some unified field theory, and that's going to make everything go with his sort of thing. So his thinking, once he became more established and had his set attached mind on what things could be, became now the establishment that was the conservative fight against quantum physics. And that happens a lot in things. I had a history professor in college. He would talk about, oh, he remembered like the 60s and all these hippies, and they'd say all these things and do all this other stuff and down with the man, and like the Who song, won't get fooled, meet the new boss, same as the old, and we're gonna do this. And now 20 years later, is they, after spending a chunk of their youth complaining about, their parents and moneyed people and wearing Brooks Brothers suits. They're now parents and moneyed people wearing Brooks Brothers suits, espousing a conservatism, that they were the ones that were going to break back in the past. So a lot of the times those cycles will continue. And established church, same thing. Sort of with that, especially since, back in the day they had like a complete control over things, and that's waned over time. Especially with that 19th century going on about, anything and everything that could even potentially whiff of anything religious, spiritual, mystical, occult, or anything, completely thrown out, completely like, no, you're all stupid idiots and you don't know anything and you're all crazy fringe sort of stuff. And it's like, in some instances, they threw some stuff out that they shouldn't be. And in some things, they kind of needed a certain break with that change to kind of change the power structures around people. Conservatism is not, oh, I already read that, my fault, sorry. Conservatism tends to be non-ideological, depending for guidance on settled tradition rather than abstract theory, and dubious of political doctrines based on idealistic views of human nature. So, non-ideological, in other words, there's not like this other sort of certain set of things that's driving it, except kind of itself. It becomes its own sort of ideology at that point and sort of thing. And they'll try and say a lot of the times that, oh, that can't be a realistic thing for us to do because not everyone thinks that way. Not everyone's going to behave that way. And to a certain extent, I agree with that. One of the things I've read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and one of the things is like, all right, all this sounds great, but you're assuming everyone thinks the way you do, and everyone doesn't think the way some of these things do. So some of these, doctrines that they're talking about, that is, has this very ideal of what people are, some of those might need a little bit of that conservatism to kind of root them or ground them. So it's like the yin and yang sort of thing. The yin side, what's the sort of black side of the fish, has a little bit of the yang sort of dot in it. It needs a little bit of that to kind of balance it out, and the yang needs a little bit of the yin in it to balance it out. So I think, again, we're talking about people who are kind of arguing in terms of it's either this or that, and honestly, you kind of need a little bit of both sometimes. And that will change. There will be instances or times in life where you need to lean a little bit more conservative, still remembering there needs to be a little bit of ideology in with that too. Sometimes you have the opportunity to really try and make something, utopian or ideal, but you still need to have a little bit of a root in something else too. In the United States, conservatism has largely been a reaction, first to the political and economic egalitarianism of the American experiment. Egalitarianism is equality. And then in the 20th century to the growth of federal power and the welfare state. Many contemporary neoconservatives, neo meaning new, are not conservative in the traditional sense, inspired as they are by activist social, economic, and religious ideologies. So instead of not having a certain ideology, they're inspired by an ideology that, again, has a certain idealistic view of mankind, where if we all just did it this way, then everything would be fine, and this would all clear up and we wouldn't have any problems with this, which is exactly the kind of thing what traditional conservatism would kind of fight against. Furthermore, modern conservatives, in their resistance to governmental intrusion and advocacy of individual responsibility and laissez-faire economics, embrace many of the doctrines of 19th century liberalism. So again, you kind of go so far to one side, you kind of become the other a little bit. So that is that for that. So competition and conservatism. Thank you.